I got that recording last weekend at the very end of the conference for the Canadian Centre for Progressive Christianity. One of the participants at that conference had said during the opening occasion of our gathering that really this document, this verse, was really encapsulated what progressive Christianity is all about. The values and the things that were written about back then were ones that we still aspire to, only now we're doing it more decidedly within church. This picture, Rob Wallace, if you're watching, my boyfriend in grade 9 gave me, and I still have it. His name was Rob, and I loved it, and so I've kept it all these years. It's been on the bulletin board in my office for the last 15 years since I have been here. But the words, for many of us, those of us who remember when it used to be on the radio, the words have drawn us to a broader picture of ourselves as children of the universe, not just of a particular time and place or of a particular context or family or a hockey team. It drew us beyond our boundaries. I love that it is supposed to have been written in the year that my mother was born, because that places it in a time that's distinctly different from where we are now. Long before many of the things that we think are normal and common were taking place. Long before many of the things that engage me on a day-to-day basis for large portions of time were even thought of. And yet the principles that underlie this are ones that suggest that the way that I use those tools or access those tools or use them to make change in the world could be informed by many of the things that Ehrman had put in this piece of poetry so long ago. I wanted to talk today about change and how it is brought about and some of the things that we have seen happening in the world around us. Some years ago, several members of this congregation met with members of another one or two congregations, I can't quite remember, but we met at Church of the Master, used that building, that facility, to engage in a day of thinking about what the future would look like. It was facilitated by the staff people from Toronto United Church Council. Toronto United Church Council is a financial body that's at arm's length from the United Church, but that manages money for congregations that have endowments and have funds that they invest in other congregations like us that have mortgages. And Toronto United Church Council holds our mortgage. And so they came to help us see what the future might look like for our congregation and others, and offered an opportunity to engage in that conversation. One of the things that they did was to show a slideshow and ask us if we could recognize the aerial views, from the aerial view, what the neighborhood that the picture was of. And most of us couldn't do that. One picture showed a road going what would be north if the picture was oriented appropriately, one going east-west, one a little jogged off to the side, and a big empty space that looked like someone had taken the dirt and gone like this on the corner. That's all that was in the picture of Scarborough General Hospital at that point in time. It had yet to be built, although obviously the plans were underway and the work was about to progress. There were pictures of stores, little hardware stores that have long since gone, and cottage-type housing, which is no longer around either. And at one crossroads was Washington United Church, a congregation now known as Scarborough Bluffs United Church, a few blocks down the street from us, and the original United Church presence in this area. The neighborhood has changed substantially since those pictures were taken, most of them in the 1950s, just as this part of the world, this little bit of outside Toronto, was beginning to develop as a suburb. Scarborough was becoming the place where the dream of the family was going to be lived out. And so congregations were built, many of them across the street from sites where schools were being built, and single-family homes with ground-level access were being built all around them as communities were being created according to a vision of what that would be. Now, the world has shifted and changed since then in Scarborough. Ouch. Is that okay? The world has shifted and changed since that picture in Scarborough, and even since I have been here, which has been about 15 years. When I arrived here, one of the first things that I looked at as a leader in the community, a community I did not know, was what was going on around the church. And at that point in time, the motel strip along Kingston Road was very heavily populated as part of the family residence program of the City of Toronto, a hostel, if you might. The motels offered rooms as were needed by the city services as they sought to place families that were in need of housing into some place that they could be. Sometimes they were there for a few weeks, sometimes they were there for a few months. And as I came to know the community, I came to find what a challenge that was to those who lived in this neighborhood. It was a challenge to the children who went to school, whose families were settled in this neighborhood, because their classrooms were changing at such a rapid rate. They would have children come in 1 week and gone 3 weeks later, just as they were getting to know one another. Teachers by November didn't know the names of the children in their class because those children were changing all the time. The community business people had a constant shift in clientele, and being responsive to a demographic is something that's enormously important if you're trying to be an entrepreneur trying to start a business, but not knowing who that clientele might be as it shifted and changed over time was very, very challenging. Since then, the motels, that elastic shelter system of the City of Toronto has shifted somewhat, and there's only one motel that's currently used for that purpose along this strip along Kingston Road. That population has been dispersed throughout Toronto. I'm never really sure whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, because the school system here had learned how to respond to those children who were so in need. I remember having a conversation with some of the professors from the University of Toronto who had done a study into the investment of money in young children, who their study had shown if you invested $1 in a child, in a preschool child, you saved $2 later on in social funding. And that didn't match a number that I had historically heard about a program that had taken place and a study that had taken place in Michigan that showed that if you put $1 into a child at a preschool age, you'd save $7 in social funding. And so I called the professors to have that conversation and find out what that discrepancy was. And he said, oh, well, we're talking about middle-class families that have children that go to school, you know, and what a difference it makes in theirs. And I said, so if we're talking about homeless children, that would be a very different number. You'd see a number much closer to the Ypsilanti number, which was 1 to 7. And they said, oh, well, there's no such thing as homeless children. And I said, are you crazy? You haven't been to Scarborough if you think there's no such thing as homeless children. We have motels filled with them. And so we raise awareness. We stretch awareness, we stretch understanding, and we shift our perspective of the world. Change is taking place in our community now, and probably in the same direction that it's been taking place over the last 30 years. Dana, if you could show us that first map. I was fortunate enough to receive this week in the mail a program by a group, or a booklet by the group called Neighborhood Change. They have a website, neighborhoodchange.ca. The United Way and the City of Toronto have undertaken to look at significant, 13 I believe it is, significant communities in the City of Toronto that have challenges, that have needs, that are high-risk communities. This is a map of the City of Toronto from 1970. And what they have found is they have been looking at these studies, it's that there's really 3 cities in Toronto. They're taking the average individual income and then looking at those groups that are 20% above the average income or 20% below the average income. We end up with 3 different cities. There's the blue city, which is a city of relative affluence, the average individual income above 20% over the norm for Toronto. We have those within 20% above or 20% below, which would be the middle class as we think of it. And then there's the brown population in the picture, which is 20% below the average income. And this map shows, if we ever get to look at it, this map shows that Scarborough is this great white cloud of middle class, which perfectly perfectly matches the pictures and the conversation that we were having with the Toronto United Church Council a few years ago. Moving into this area was a vast group of people, single families, that wanted to have a home and a yard for their kids. And so the population, that middle-class boom in population, was very much out in this area of the city. If you aren't familiar with the city of Toronto, it's that area this way. And the wealth was centered around the center and some challenged areas around to the west and in the deep south portions of the city. 30 years later, can you flick us to the next map? It's changed substantially. This is such a graphic image of what's happened in our city that I found it breathtaking. I mean, I knew the statistics that the middle class has gone from 69% down to 29% over the last 30 years, that they're totally disappearing. But the image that the greatest proportion of our city has less than 20% of the average individual income in the city is stunning. So what does that mean for us as a community, and what does that mean for the city of Toronto? I want to look at this in terms of volunteerism and what we do as volunteers. What we do as volunteers on a city scale, what we do as volunteers on a global scale, what we do as volunteers on a church scale, and what we do as volunteers personally. Now, when I talk about volunteers, I'm talking about what we do for. I'm not talking about what people do for us, the volunteers that make our lives different. I'm talking about what we do as volunteers for the better of the world or the city or the church community. And it's great. It's huge. It's not mapped out like this, though. If we were to map it out, we might see pretty much the same thing. In the 1970s, there was a vast group of volunteers that were working to make those neighborhoods work. They were working in schools, they were working in libraries, they were working in churches, they were working in programs throughout the community that strengthened the community and brought people together, that strengthened children, that strengthened relationships, that strengthened what the city looked like. And you were a lot of those people, or your parents were those people. And that whole vast white area had an enormous resource in terms of human resources and what they did for the world around them and for the communities in which they lived. Coming a little closer to home, we see that in churches, we had a vast variety of volunteers available to us as well. My dad was the chair of finance. My mother was the head of the UCW until she closed it down. You know, maybe it runs in the family. But the work that they did, and the work that all my friends' parents did, volunteering in the church, was vast. The number of hours that were offered to the church, because the church was seen as a significant part of community, working for change, for positive change, and for the building of relationship and the stabilizing of families and the raising of children within a set of moral values. That volunteer work was extremely important, and so they gave themselves to it in a huge way. But as we've seen the economic shifts happen, and as women have been liberated to the point that we now have 2 full-time occupations, one as mother and housekeeper and homemaker, and one outside of that doing something else. I'm not sure whether that's liberation or what it is, but it's real. The numbers of volunteers that have been able to support and keep church groups going, and the number of volunteers that have gone to create those very solid, very important relationships within community have dwindled incredibly. And I think that we would see the second map with that vast array of the brown shading showing that there were not as many volunteers as there have been in the past. This is not a call for volunteers. This is a request for us to think about something like this. Because the next level of volunteer I want to talk about is our volunteer work for ourselves, and how much time and energy we give toward ourselves. As our volunteer energies for the community, our civic volunteer time and energy has dwindled, and our religious institution volunteer time and energy has dwindled, we haven't found ourselves with a surfeit of time to pay attention to ourselves. We haven't found ourselves given to an extra couple of hours in meditation, or journal writing, or yoga, or walks on the bluffs. We haven't created more time for ourselves to focus on that caregiving that we need to do. We have found ourselves stretched to incredible limits by the things that are happening in our world, the lists that we have to keep, that sandwich generation that takes care of parents and children. We have found ourselves running out of time to volunteer on our own behalf, to give and serve ourselves. And I see it from my perspective as I watch volunteers race into this place to do what they can do because they have written down that they would do it, and then race out to get on with their everyday. And volunteers who take on significant roles and offer themselves, pour their lives and their energies into it. But then, when that amount of time is given up, not having the time to sit here and be embraced by community and be healed and made whole again by being in this place. We have become, like our city, a place that ravages individuals because we don't take that time to volunteer for our own hearts. Like most of my sermons, I have no answer to this problem. I wish that I did. I wish that I could put it out there with a little guidebook, maybe a few pictures and some interesting graphs, and say, do this for yourselves. But for each of you it would be different. It would have to be. Because religion that had all the answers and the guidebook that said this will make it all better no longer works for you people. It does still work for some, but for you, it does not work. Each of you needs to go and find that time that Deb offered you, that 5 seconds, maybe, 60, 70 times a day? To just check in and see how you are. And when all the swear words fade away, and you find out how you are, then offer yourself some volunteer time. Volunteer to make yourself well. Volunteer to make yourself whole. Is it that walk you need to take? Was it that picture you needed to paint? Was it the time with your grandchildren on the floor? Was it while you're on the TTC, not checking emails, but reading a book you've been trying to get to? What is it that you can do? And what is it that we can do to save ourselves from what we are becoming, from what we're doing to ourselves, to allow this place to be a place of healing and wholeness, a place of encouragement, wrapping our hearts around one another, a place of peace and a place of hope. Many of us were rejuvenated last night by the opportunity to come together and sit around tables and get to know one another a little better and have a time of companionship and fellowship. And that's good. But it took a lot of energy to make it happen. And so what we gain is traded off in many ways. How do we make it all gain? How do we do that? And how do we honor those who are taking up that burden of volunteerism in our communities? Ruth and Dorothy off in Ottawa learning this weekend so that they can come back and bring us the truths about how our federal government interacts with our First Nations communities on their reserves and what we can do to make a difference. And then find that grounding space so that we can actually do that. And how do we honor those volunteers in our community, many of them in tents right now down at St. James Park, volunteering their energy and pouring their lives into making a better world the way they see it, for their families, for their children, for the future of this city, this country, this world? How do we honor those volunteers and know that they too will get just as depleted as do we? And how do we spot them so that they don't? I was incredibly encouraged a month and a half ago when Krista approached me about doing an evolutionary women's group. Incredibly encouraged, because I knew that that meant that there would be people coming together to be about healing and wholeness and caring for one another. And that in the process of doing that, they would be strengthening each other within community and within themselves. And I'm encouraged because I know that once that model gets going, that there are others of you who in that space might offer yourselves and gifts, not in a way that will ravage, but in a way that will bless, in a way that will honor, in a way that will gift both yourself and the community. Because I'm sure that's what happens when we do that. I invite you to be a part of a compassionate community, to be part of a compassionate self to yourself, and to be present in a way that those 60 or 70 times a day of reflection tell you you need to be. We are a force for change in this world, and it weighs heavily upon our shoulders. I know that. But I also know that when we reach out to one another, when we shelter one another, when we feel the shelter others have offered, that work is a gift, and we can become excited about it. With all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it is still a beautiful world. Love it, love yourself, and be whole. Amen.